First off, like Sister Kimberly, I would really like to say thank you to everybody who attended here, to Winnie, and this tremendous amount of work that you've done of pulling this together. I think that Denise as well, and everybody who is here. It's a real challenge to kind of follow a talk by Dr. Crenshaw. I know this not just from tonight, but also from her presentation, I think, at the Durban conference some years ago in South Africa. That was the first time that I heard her. And I knew that this person, Kimberly Crenshaw, was somebody to keep your eyes on. Not only because of her law background, which is tremendous and what she brings to this subject, but really here was someone, I thought, who was a changer. You know, we talk about social justice and wanting to transform. Well, here was a lived reality right in front of me, making sure that she was addressing not just the issues of blacks in the United States, but blacks around the world. I remember the position on reparations that was advanced at that conference. And this is why when we said for Social Justice Week that we needed to have you here, because reparations is back on the agenda, I see, once again. So thank you so much. I just have, what, 15 minutes? This is a challenge, if that. So just some highlights, I think, from your talk that I would like perhaps to throw out for me that evoked some ideas, some thinking about. But I think from a university standpoint and from a lot of people here from community organizations and do a lot in terms of community organizing, some things that I think that I got from your talk that I would really like to expand on, perhaps from the audience as well, to kind of have us kind of share some discussion later on about these ideas. There are 4 things I think that I want to follow up on. One is this whole concept of the era of post-racialization. When we hear this concept, when I hear this concept, first and foremost, I think of it not only in the context of the United States, but I think of it post-coloniality, post-colonialism and what this means. I think of it in terms of the issue of globalization, and I think of it in terms of the liberal kinds of ideologies and positionings that we have to deal with in this era. So not just the issue of race, which is central, I think, in the talk, but how this whole post-racialized era that we're living in, what does it have to tell us about globalization? What does it have to tell us about this whole issue in terms of liberal politics that we live under, right? So it's an ongoing discussion and a question. I don't think that there is a finite answer to it. But I like to think about it in the context of Canada, and I like to think about it in the context particularly of this city that we're in. Now, one of the things about, or links, I think, with the United States, particularly for us from the Black community, is that you happen to be, those of you in the United States, I think that we look up to you very much in terms of the struggles, in terms of concepts that you use, such as this. But as we look, and this fits in, I think, quite well with Canada that sees, I used to think of it as the 51st state, because there's so much of the culture of the US that influences us here. So when you talk about post-racialization, for instance, this is a concept I see that comes from the United States, but what does it have really to do with us? And I think some of the points that you point out for me in thinking about post-racialization, I think here in Canada, it fits quite nicely with what I see as a kind of cultural, historical discourse. And that is the discourse of politeness. A discourse that says not only are we past the issue of race due to Obama, but historically in this country there is a politeness that says we do not talk about the nasty subject of race. It belongs to the United States, After all, that's where slavery was. That is where we had Jim Crow laws. That is where we have all the kinds of segregation and all of the struggles of segregation. And it eclipses for us, I think, in this country, the whole focus about the history of race in this country, beginning with First Nations communities, beginning with the black loyalists who came here in the 1600s and who live out in Nova Scotia, beginning with, of course, the people who came via the Underground Railroad and struggled to make life and meaning in Southern Ontario. And so there is a lot of that history that is not really talked about at all in this country. And politely, I think politeness as this discourse covers over this, and it fits very well in this era of post-racialization. So we need not talk about race. We have a history of not really talking about it. And then, of course, now we have the liberal policies, if you will, and we have globalization. The other thing I think that fits in with this post-racialized era is that in Canada, we are known, quote unquote, if we're going to talk about race, as that we're a country of immigrants. So we've forgotten all the other racial folks who've been here. So it's seen as though we are new arrivals. We've only been here since the Immigration Act was lifted in 1967, allowing race not to be used as a category and allowing blacks to come here or others to come here, mainly because of the need of cheap labor. So that we don't have to talk about race very much in terms of, again, not just globalization, but because of this history that we are seen as a country of immigrants, particularly in this city. And so when you raise the issue of race or talk about things that are related to racial policies or practices or changes, it is seen as though you have just arrived. You just arrived, and here you're asking for some things that you do not deserve. So it is the undeserved who is now pushing governments to take up this issue of race. This is supported very much by the Multicultural Act, a federal policy which looks very much at ethnicity, culture, and if anything at all, under the federal government, we are recognized in terms of our visibility. So we're talked about as visible minorities, but nowhere in that act is the word race inscribed. So there's always a struggle here for us to talk about race culturally because it's hidden, it's always been hidden. And in policy formations, there's no leadership at the federal level about this issue of race. You can capture race perhaps as the visible minority category, as cultural, as ethnic, as national, et cetera, but really you cannot just talk about race. And I was mentioning earlier that where race comes in is where we have a set of codes, human rights codes, because Canada is a signatory to the United Nations Declaration Against Discrimination, and so thou shalt not discriminate on the basis of race. So in human rights codes, whether it's at the federal level or whether it's at provincial level, you'll find that the word race. And then, of course, it's because of you're treated badly, and so you have a complaint mechanism to redress race. And that's the focal point. So that's the starting point, I think, in terms of one of the discourses that we have to kind of really talk about. What is this lack of focus of race in public policy? We're always at the end gate, sort of pushing to put race on the table. And I think for many of us who deal with the issue of race, particularly in the black community here, we are seen very much, I think, as the problem people. So that when race comes on the table, it's because of another shooting. It's because we're asking for a black-focused school. We're asking for employment equity to redress issues of employment based on this category of race. Race is very problematic for us, and if we are in a post-racialized era, just imagine what that means if historically we've never been able to kind of really get race its full merit that it needs to be. We have to keep always kind of pushing. The other thing that I wanted to kind of point out for us is the issue then about how we have struggled, and this brings us down, I think, for people in this room, how we have had to struggle for all kinds of changes to government policy. So one of the big struggles here was for this thing called employment equity. Employment equity. And most of us will know that we came to employment equity through the Abella report. I like to remind people that it took a lot of the community organizing to bring that term to fruition, that Judge Abella made it popular, but actually it was not Judge Abella. And this is one of the issues as well. So when the community moves in a particular direction to make some changes, very often the community is not given the credit for the work that it has done. Nevertheless, we have something called employment equity. A mechanism, and Grace reminded me this afternoon about this mechanism of employment equity, at least at the federal level, because it is a policy that says then we need to kind of gather the data. So it is a data, very positivist in how it collects this kind of data, if you will, evidence-based, that we have so many who have identified in a particular category, so that, again, even the collection of that data by some institutions under the federal jurisdiction is problematic. And for universities, we have to collect that if we have to, as a contractor for the federal government funds. So Ryerson, for instance, will collect that information under the category that we have something called visible minority, not blacks. Okay? Now, what do you do with that policy? What do you do with that data that is collected? Does it influence admissions? Does it influence the curriculum? What do you do with this? It is a contractual obligation between the university and the federal government to provide that kind of information. Where it goes from there is unknown, because there's no mechanism to say how many blacks are in this university. You can guess, but there's no mechanism for that. And the last point that I want to talk about then is at the provincial level. Some years ago, coalition of all kinds of different groups pressed the provincial government for employment equity, which you might call perhaps similar to affirmative action, but not quite the same at all. And we had a government that came into power, and in one fell swoop, that was the first act that was rescinded, the Employment Equity Act. There are still groups here that are still pushing for an employment equity gap, because we have a gap. We have so many gaps in employment where we do not see the representation, particularly at the higher levels. We may see at the entry-level positions, we see people of color, but if you go a little bit higher, then the whole establishment very often looks white. So there has to be, for us, in terms of dealing, particularly around issues of race, for us, it is a question about resistance. And in this globalized, post-racial society, I like to say that we have become the I generation. It is me, myself, and I. There is less organizing that's taking place. There is less resistance, at least formal resistance, aided and abetted, I think, by some of the policies and practices of neoliberalism that we have. Students cannot stick around very often to be part of an organizing. They have jobs that they have to go to. Many of them are parents. They have children that they have to raise. So it gets down to the kinds of strategies, I think, and tactics that we have to really utilize in order to address these issues of what I see as neoliberal kinds of policies, the globalization that's taking place, the kinds of efforts, if you will, that says you do not need to organize. You do not need to organize, even though we know that changes do not come without organizing. But in this era, we're more and more feeling that, there's no need, because we're past that. We're past racial. We're past racism. We have a concept that we're using, I think, quite liberally without quite knowing how to kind of use it, and it's the concept that you've raised, and that is critical, that intersectionality. And the minute we bring that issue on the table, it's interesting what appears and what disappears. And race has a tendency to disappear very quickly under intersectionality. In my school, in social work, we use the concept of anti-oppression. A problematic exists in that because they say it is a modernist notion, this whole taking up of different forms of oppression, whether it is by race or gender or class, it comes out of a modernist idea. So we've tried to move it away into sort of postmodernist idea. But what are we talking about? Because we still go back to those structures. We still have to deal with those structures in order to kind of dismantle them, in order to resist. So post-structuralism on the one hand tells us, yes, that we can talk about discourses and we could talk about identity and essentializing and all of those kinds of meaningful concepts. I don't mean to put them down entirely, but really and truly they have on the ground level in terms of really knowing how to resist and keep race alive, how to keep that issue of race, particularly for large populations of people who are in this city, that race is a critical issue, and we cannot eclipse that issue, even though we're under this culture that says we are so polite that we won't talk about race, that we will talk about visible minority, we'll talk about ethnicity, we'll talk about culture, we'll talk about diversity. But actually, when you look at the life, and you look at the struggles, and you look at where these groups who are racialized, we find that we're not moving sufficiently. I mean, those are the things that I take from your talk, and I throw it out to the wider audience to add or